November 18, 1987. A Wednesday evening in London. King's Cross St Pancras Underground Station, one of the busiest transportation hubs in the United Kingdom, a sprawling interchange connecting 6 different tube lines beneath the streets of central London. During peak hours, this station handles more passenger traffic than almost any other in the city's vast underground network. Commuters rush through its corridors and escalators, moving between the Piccadilly, Victoria, Northern, Metropolitan, Hammersmith and City and Circle lines. On this particular Wednesday, over 100,000 passengers will pass through King's Cross during the course of the day, a normal, unremarkable figure for this critical junction in London's transportation infrastructure. By 7:30 p.m., the evening rush hour has ended. The frantic crush of commuters heading home from work has subsided, replaced by a more relaxed flow of people, tourists, late workers, individuals heading out for evening entertainment. The station staff is transitioning from the heightened alertness required during peak hours to the more routine operations of a normal evening. Nobody has any reason to expect that within the next 30 minutes, this station will become the site of the deadliest fire in London Underground history, a disaster that will kill 31 people, injure 100 more, reveal catastrophic safety failures, and lead to the discovery of a previously unknown fire behavior phenomenon that will change how firefighters around the world understand and respond to underground fires. Before we dive into exactly what went wrong, and how a small fire transformed into an inferno that consumed an entire ticket hall in seconds, make sure you subscribe to this channel and leave a comment about where you're watching from. The story of King's Cross is not just about a tragic fire, it's about organizational complacency, ignored warnings, a culture that prioritized cost savings over safety, and the discovery of scientific principles that nobody knew existed until they killed dozens of people. King's Cross Station has a long history dating back to the mid-19th century. The original station opened in 1852 as part of the expansion of London's railway network. When the Underground began construction, King's Cross became a natural location for a major interchange given its position in central London and its existing mainline railway connections. Over decades, as new tube lines were constructed and the Underground network expanded, King's Cross grew into an increasingly complex maze of platforms, tunnels, escalators, and passageways connecting multiple lines at different levels beneath the city streets. By 1987, the station's infrastructure reflected more than a century of piecemeal expansion and modification. Some sections were modern and well maintained. Others dated back to the early 20th century or even the Victorian era, built with materials and design philosophies that reflected the knowledge and priorities of their time. The escalators at King's Cross, the moving staircases that carried passengers between the deep-level tube platforms and the surface-level ticket hall, were a mix of old and new. Some had been upgraded to modern all-metal construction, others retained wooden components that had been installed decades earlier, including wooden escalator steps, wooden side panels, and wooden structural elements beneath the moving stairs. Escalator number 4, which served the Piccadilly line platform, was one of these older wooden escalators. It had been installed in the 1930s, and despite decades of service, had never been fully modernized. The escalator was 138 feet long, about 42 meters, and climbed at a 30-degree angle from the deep-level platform up to the ticket hall. The escalator tunnel that enclosed it was 23 feet in diameter, creating an enclosed trench-like space with the moving escalator at its bottom. The sides of this tunnel were lined with advertisement panels, and beneath the moving steps was a mechanical space housing the machinery that drove the escalator, gears, chains, motors and lubrication systems necessary to keep thousands of moving parts operating smoothly. That lubrication is important to this story. The mechanical components beneath and alongside the escalator required regular greasing to prevent wear and ensure smooth operation. Over the years, workers had applied substantial quantities of heavy grease to gears, chains and moving parts. Some of this grease inevitably dripped or was flung off onto surrounding surfaces, the underside of the wooden steps, the floor of the mechanical space, the walls of the escalator tunnel. Over time, this grease accumulated, mixing with dust, dirt, fiber from clothing, paper debris, and other materials that fell through gaps in the escalator or were carried by air currents through the tunnel. The result was a thick, sticky coating of highly flammable material covering many surfaces in and around the escalator mechanism. On top of this, wooden escalators inherently presented fire risks that all metal escalators did not. Wood is combustible. When it's been in service for decades in a hot, dry environment with poor ventilation, it becomes even more so. The wooden steps of escalator 4 had been subjected to decades of foot traffic, wear, heat from friction, and exposure to grease and other materials. They were essentially well-seasoned kindling, waiting for an ignition source. London Underground was aware that wooden escalators presented fire hazards. Between 1956 and 1988, there had been approximately 400 fires recorded on underground escalators. Some were minor smolderings that were quickly extinguished. Others were more serious, requiring evacuation of stations and response from the London Fire Brigade. However, and this is the critical point that would later be identified as evidence of catastrophic complacency, none of those 400 fires had resulted in any fatalities. Not one person had died in an escalator fire in over 30 years of operation. This perfect safety record created a dangerous false confidence within London Underground management. Escalator fires were seen as nuisances to be managed, not as potentially deadly hazards requiring urgent action. In 1985, 2 years before the King's Cross disaster, smoking had been banned throughout the London Underground system. The ban was implemented for multiple reasons, fire safety being one of them, but also concerns about second-hand smoke exposure, cleanliness, and passenger comfort. Signs were posted throughout stations clearly stating that smoking was prohibited. However, enforcement of the smoking ban was minimal to non-existent. Station staff rarely confronted smokers. British Transport Police focused on more serious offences. Many passengers simply ignored the regulation, particularly when using escalators between platforms and exits. They would light cigarettes as they rode up toward the street, reasoning that they were almost outside anyway. This casual disregard for the smoking ban meant that despite the regulation, lit cigarettes, matches, and lighters remained common on escalators throughout the system. Smokers would light up as they stepped onto escalators heading toward exits. Some would drop or flick matches carelessly, not considering where they might land. The gaps alongside and between escalator steps provided perfect opportunities for small burning objects to fall into the mechanical spaces below, spaces filled with grease, dust, debris, and wooden components. On the evening of November 18, 1987, this combination of factors, old wooden escalators, heavy grease accumulation, decades of debris, inadequate ventilation, ignored fire risks, and unenforced smoking bans, was about to converge into catastrophe. At 7:29 p.m., 1929 in 24-hour notation, a passenger noticed something unusual at escalator 4 on the Piccadilly line. There appeared to be a small glow of light coming from beneath the escalator steps, visible through gaps at the side of the moving stairs. A thin wisp of smoke was rising from the same location. The passenger, recognizing this probably indicated a fire, stopped the escalator using one of the emergency stop buttons positioned along its length, and began warning other passengers to avoid the area. Station staff were immediately alerted. Relief Station Inspector Christopher Hayes and a leading railman rushed to escalator 4 to assess the situation. As they approached, they confirmed what the passenger had reported. There was definitely smoke coming from beneath the escalator, and when they looked carefully through the gaps alongside the moving steps, they could see a small flickering light that indicated fire. 3 British Transport Police constables also arrived at the scene to assist. The situation at this point seemed manageable. It appeared to be a small fire located in the mechanical space beneath the escalator, probably something that had fallen through and ignited grease or debris. The London Underground had experienced hundreds of similar incidents over the years. Standard procedure was for station staff to attempt to extinguish small fires using the fire suppression equipment installed at the station. Only if the fire grew beyond staff's ability to control it would the London Fire Brigade be called. However, one of the British Transport Police constables made a decision that would prove crucial. Rather than waiting to see if station staff could handle the fire, he immediately rushed to street level and used his radio to call for help from the London Fire Brigade. At 19:33, just 4 minutes after the fire was first noticed, British Transport Police Headquarters received his call and immediately passed the emergency to the London Fire Brigade dispatcher. At 19:36, 3 fire engines were dispatched from the nearest stations to respond to a reported fire at King's Cross Underground Station. This early notification and rapid dispatch would save lives, even though the response crews would arrive to find a situation far worse than anyone anticipated. Meanwhile, Underground Station Inspector Hayes decided he needed to get a better look at what they were dealing with. Escalators have adjacent service spaces and machinery rooms that allow maintenance access to their mechanical components. Hayes entered the space adjacent to escalator 4 to assess the fire directly. What he found confirmed everyone's fears but didn't yet suggest the magnitude of disaster that was developing. The fire was burning beneath the escalator steps and was already spreading through the accumulated grease and debris. Smoke was building up in the confined space. Hayes attempted to fight the fire using a carbon dioxide extinguisher, a standard piece of firefighting equipment designed for small fires. However, his position and the location of the flames meant he couldn't get the extinguisher's discharge close enough to effectively suppress the fire. He looked around for additional equipment and spotted a water fog extinguisher nearby. But before deploying it, Hayes made another decision. He went to the escalator's machinery room and activated the circuit breaker to cut electrical power to the escalator. This was good fire safety practice. Cutting power removed one potential source of ignition and eliminated the risk of electrical shock for anyone fighting the fire. However, it also meant the escalator was now fully stopped with the fire burning beneath it. Up in the ticket hall, the main public area at street level, where passengers purchased tickets, checked information boards, and transitioned between the underground and the surface, station staff were beginning to take precautionary measures. As smoke from escalator 4 began drifting upward into the ticket hall, staff made the decision to stop the adjacent escalators as a safety measure and began directing passengers to evacuate the ticket hall and use alternative exits or routes through the station. However, trains were still running. Passengers were still arriving at platforms and beginning their journey up escalators, unaware that anything was wrong. At 1942, 9 minutes after the fire was first reported, and 6 minutes after fire engines were dispatched, the first units from the London Fire Brigade arrived at King's Cross Station. Station Officer Colin Townsley and Temporary Sub-Officer Roger Bell, both experienced firefighters, immediately proceeded underground to assess the situation and determine what resources would be needed. As they descended from street level toward the ticket hall, they could already smell smoke and see haze in the air. Something was definitely burning, but they still expected to find a relatively minor escalator fire, the kind of incident the underground experienced routinely. When Townsley and Bell reached the ticket hall and looked down into the Piccadilly Line escalator tunnel, what they saw appeared manageable, but required immediate action. Flames were visible approximately halfway down escalator 4, licking up the left-hand handrail. The flames were approximately 4 feet high, significant but not yet suggesting a major incident. Smoke was accumulating in the escalator tunnel and drifting into the ticket hall, but visibility was still reasonable. This looked like a situation that a properly deployed fire hose could control. Station Officer Townsley immediately called for firefighters equipped with breathing apparatus to come down from street level and set up a water jet to attack the fire. The breathing apparatus was necessary because smoke was building up and would be dangerous to work in without respiratory protection. As firefighters began moving equipment and preparing to deploy hoses, something else was happening that nobody fully understood at the time. Passengers were still arriving at the station. A Piccadilly Line train had just pulled into the platform below. Passengers were disembarking and beginning to make their way toward escalators. Some were heading up escalator 4, unaware that the stopped escalator was on fire. Others were using the Victoria Line escalators, which were still operating and led up to the same ticket hall where smoke was now quite visible. The Underground's control center, recognizing the growing danger, issued orders for Piccadilly and Victoria Line trains not to stop at King's Cross, but this order came too late to prevent passengers from the most recent trains from entering the station's circulation spaces. In the ticket hall, the scene was becoming increasingly chaotic. Station staff were trying to direct passengers toward exits, while also trying to understand the scope of the fire below. Some passengers, seeing smoke, were moving quickly toward exits. Others, perhaps accustomed to minor incidents in the underground, were not showing particular urgency. The smell of smoke was strong now, and visibility was decreasing as more smoke poured up from the escalator tunnel. What nobody, not the station staff, not the transport police, not the firefighters, understood at this moment was that beneath escalator 4, a phenomenon was developing that had never been scientifically documented. The fire that had started as a small flame, probably from a discarded match or cigarette, that fell through a gap and ignited grease-soaked debris, was now spreading in a pattern that fire scientists would later realize they had never properly analyzed. The fire was burning vertically at first. As fires typically do, flames rise because hot gases are less dense than cool air. But the escalator tunnel created unique conditions. The 30-degree angle of the escalator, the enclosed tunnel around it, The accumulation of flammable materials along its length, and the way air was flowing through the space, were combining to create what would later be named the trench effect. A previously unknown fire behavior, where flames transition from burning vertically to spreading horizontally along an inclined surface, rapidly accelerating up the slope, like a liquid flowing uphill. As flames heated the grease, debris and wooden components beneath and alongside the escalator steps, flammable gases were being produced through pyrolysis, the chemical decomposition of materials when heated. These gases were filling the escalator tunnel, mixing with air in proportions that were becoming increasingly dangerous. The tunnel was essentially becoming a confined space filled with a flammable gas mixture, heated to progressively higher temperatures, with an active ignition source at its base. At 7:45 p.m., 16 minutes after the fire was first noticed, the situation at King's Cross Underground Station transformed from a manageable incident into a catastrophic disaster in approximately 15 seconds. The flashover occurred. For those unfamiliar with fire behavior, a flashover is one of the most dangerous phenomena in structural firefighting. It occurs when a fire in a confined space has been burning long enough to heat all the surfaces and fill the space with flammable gases from pyrolysis. When these gases reach their auto-ignition temperature, the point at which they spontaneously combust without needing direct contact with flames, the entire space erupts into fire simultaneously. Everything that can burn begins burning at once. Temperatures skyrocket in seconds. A room that contained a fire suddenly becomes entirely filled with fire. At King's Cross, the flashover didn't occur in a room, it occurred in the escalator tunnel, and its effects were devastating and immediate. The fire that had been burning beneath and alongside escalator 4 suddenly burst out from the escalator tunnel into the ticket hall. Flames erupted from the escalator entrance like a blowtorch, shooting across the ceiling of the ticket hall. In less than 1 minute, the entire ceiling was burning. Fire spread into surrounding passages and corridors with terrifying speed. The lights went out, the intense heat damaged electrical systems, plunging the ticket hall into darkness broken only by the orange glow of flames. The temperature in the ticket hall, which moments before had been uncomfortably warm from smoke and heat rising from below, suddenly became life-threatening. Survivors would later describe the heat as like being in an oven, the air itself seeming to burn. Chaos erupted instantly. Passengers who had been in the ticket hall, some trying to evacuate, some just arriving, some waiting for information, found themselves trapped in a burning space with no visibility and no clear path to safety. The natural human response to fire, run away from it, was complicated by the facts that the fire was now everywhere. It was completely dark, smoke made breathing nearly impossible, and panic was spreading faster than the flames. Station Officer Townsley was in the ticket hall when the flashover occurred. He and Temporary Sub-Officer Bell had been assessing the situation and coordinating the firefighting response. When the explosion of flames burst from the escalator tunnel, Townsley was caught in the open. Witnesses who survived described seeing a wall of fire erupt from the escalator entrance and sweep across the ceiling. The force of the heat was so intense that people were knocked down. The firefighters who had been preparing to deploy hoses and attack the fire with water found their situation had changed catastrophically in seconds. There was no longer a fire to attack, they were inside the fire. Training and instinct took over. Those near exits or with clear paths of escape moved toward them, many of them guiding passengers and helping people who had been knocked down or were disoriented by smoke and darkness. Those trapped deeper in the ticket hall had to make split-second decisions about whether to try to run through flames or take cover and hope for rescue. Temporary Sub-Officer Bell, who had been with Townsley in the ticket hall, found himself separated when the flashover occurred. As flames erupted around him, Bell's position was slightly different from Townsley's. He was near the top of the Piccadilly line escalator, rather than in the center of the ticket hall. His firefighting training and experience allowed him to assess the situation in the seconds available. Passengers were still coming up the escalator behind him, heading directly into the inferno developing at the top. Bell made the decision to go back down the escalator, into the smoke and heat, to stop passengers from continuing upward into the flames. Running down a stopped escalator through smoke toward fire while everyone else is trying to escape takes extraordinary courage. Bell reached the platform level and began directing passengers back down to the platform, away from the escalator, telling them to board the next train or find alternative exits. Once he had secured the platform and ensured no more passengers were entering the deadly escalator tunnel, Bell turned back toward the fire. He grabbed a fire hose that had been staged at the platform level, and despite the intense heat and smoke, began climbing back up escalator 4, deploying the hose as he went, attempting to attack the flames that were now fully engulfing the escalator tunnel. Bell's actions going into the fire rather than away from it, securing the platform to prevent more casualties, then attacking the fire despite overwhelming odds, would later be recognized as extraordinarily heroic. But at the moment it happened, he was simply doing what his training and his commitment to saving lives demanded. Up at street level, the scene was one of immediate horror. From the smoke-filled entrance to King's Cross Station, horrific sounds were emerging, screams of people trapped inside, the roar of fire, the crash of materials collapsing. Firefighters who had just arrived were rushing to get equipment ready, but before they could even connect hoses to hydrants and charge them with water, the flashover had occurred. All they could do initially was watch flames pour from the station entrance and listen to the screams of people dying inside. British Transport Police Constable Stephen Hanson was in the ticket hall when the flashover occurred. He was thrown to the floor by the force of the heat and the blast wave of hot air. As he lay on the ground with flames roaring overhead, Hanson faced a choice: stay down and likely die from heat and smoke inhalation, or try to crawl towards safety through what had become an inferno. He chose to crawl. Staying as low as possible where the air was slightly cooler and less filled with smoke, Hanson began moving toward where he thought an exit might be. In the darkness and chaos, with flames overhead and smoke making it nearly impossible to see or breathe, navigation was almost impossible. As he crawled, Hanson encountered the bodies of people who had collapsed, some already dead, others still alive but overcome by smoke and unable to move. The floor itself was becoming hot enough to burn skin. As Hanson made agonizing progress toward what he hoped was safety, he heard voices and saw movement near the Victoria Line escalator entrance. A group of passengers was coming up from the Victoria Line platform, completely unaware of what they were about to encounter at the top. These passengers had been on a train that arrived just as or shortly after the flashover occurred. They had disembarked and stepped onto the escalator, expecting a normal journey up to the ticket hall and then out to the street. Instead, they were heading into hell. Hanson, despite his own desperate situation, recognized these people were in immediate mortal danger. If they reached the ticket hall at its current state, they would likely die. Drawing on reserves of strength and courage, Hanson crawled toward the Victoria Line escalator to intercept the arriving passengers. When he reached them, he shouted, though his voice was damaged from smoke inhalation, for them to stay as low as possible and follow him. He would lead them out. The group, Hanson didn't know how many, he could barely see, crouched low and followed the constable as he crawled and stumbled through the burning ticket hall. They had to navigate around and sometimes over the bodies of people who had collapsed. They could hear screaming from people trapped in areas they couldn't reach. The heat was so intense that exposed skin was burning, but Hanson kept moving, kept leading, kept directing the group toward where his sense of direction and training told him an exit should be. After what must have seemed like hours but was probably only minutes, Hanson and his group broke through into clearer air and found an exit. They emerged onto the street, burned, injured, traumatized but alive. Constable Hanson had suffered severe burns and smoke inhalation. He would require extensive medical treatment and would never fully recover from his injuries. But he had saved the lives of an unknown number of passengers through his actions. It's impossible to know exactly how many people followed him out of the fire, as in the chaos nobody was counting, but estimates suggest he led out between 10 and 20 passengers who would otherwise have died in the ticket hall. Down on the Victoria Line platform, a station staff member made a split-second decision that saved 200 lives. Hearing chaos from above and seeing smoke, he ran onto the tracks as a train approached and waved frantically for it to stop. The driver slammed the brakes. The staff member shouted for every passenger on the platform to board immediately. The station was on fire. Evacuate via train, not escalators. 200 people crammed onto that single train and escaped. Had they used the escalators, they would have walked directly into the inferno and died. At street level, fire engines were arriving from across London. 5 pumps, 10, eventually 30, one of the largest operations the city had seen in years. At 19:59, the first ambulances arrived. Paramedics found dozens of burned, choking survivors collapsing onto the pavement. Some had burns covering half their bodies, others were coughing up black soot, their lungs seared by superheated air. 3 firefighters made the decision to force entry back into the burning station. One advanced while the other two sprayed his back with water, the only way to survive the radiant heat. At the bottom of the stairs, they found Station Officer Colin Townsley, dead. His uniform was intact, he died from suffocation, not burns. Next to him lay the badly burned body of a passenger. Townsley had died trying to rescue someone else. Temporary Sub-Officer Roger Bell was assumed dead. But the truth was different. Bell had been at the bottom of the Piccadilly escalator when the explosion of flames occurred above him. Rather than fleeing, Bell grabbed a fire hose and spent the next 2 hours fighting the fire alone, preventing it from spreading deeper into the underground tunnels. His solitary firefighting effort would later be recognized as extraordinarily heroic. By 21:48, 2 hours after the flashover, 30 fire engines finally brought the blaze under control. Hours more passed before it was fully extinguished. When investigators could finally enter, they found total devastation. The ticket hall was a burned-out cavity. Concrete walls had literally exploded from heat. The escalators were destroyed. Wood burned away, metal twisted and melted. 31 people were dead, all in or near the ticket hall. 100 injured, 19 with severe burns. Many victims were so badly cremated that identification required dental records and forensic analysis. Some had been reduced to skeletal remains and ash. Among the dead, commuters, tourists, station staff, united only by terrible coincidence. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher visited King's Cross that night. Walking through the burned-out station, she was visibly shaken. She immediately ordered a full public inquiry to answer 3 questions. What started the fire? How did it spread so catastrophically? Could it have been prevented? The investigation that followed would change fire science forever. Chief Investigator Desmond Fennell assembled fire scientists, engineers and forensic experts. They built a 1/3 scale replica of Escalator 4 and created sophisticated computer simulations modeling heat, smoke, and combustion. Through dozens of experiments, researchers made a stunning discovery. The fire didn't spread the way fires were supposed to spread. Standard theory said flames burn vertically, hot gases rise. But the scale model showed something extraordinary. The fire burned vertically for 1 minute 11 seconds, then suddenly the flames bent horizontal and raced up the escalator at increasing speed, hugging the steps like liquid flowing uphill. This had never been observed before. Fire scientists were witnessing behavior that contradicted established understanding. They had discovered a previously unknown phenomenon, the trench effect. The trench effect occurs when fire burns in an inclined tunnel. The Coanda effect, where fast-moving gases stick to nearby surfaces, caused the flames to follow the escalator's 30-degree slope. As flames traveled upward, they heated grease, debris, and wooden components, producing flammable gases that filled the tunnel. When this mixture reached 500 degrees Celsius, it spontaneously ignited throughout the entire volume simultaneously, creating the flashover that erupted into the ticket hall. The scale model showed this process could develop from small fire to flashover in 15 to 20 minutes, matching the King's Cross timeline exactly. Before this disaster, fire behavior in inclined tunnels wasn't understood. After King's Cross, the trench effect became standard training for firefighters worldwide. The discovery came at a terrible price, 31 deaths, but would inform fire safety measures globally. The investigation also revealed uncomfortable truths. 400 escalator fires between 1956 and 88 should have been warning signs. Because none had killed anyone, they were treated as routine nuisances rather than evidence of systemic risk. Classic normalization of deviance. Because catastrophe hadn't happened yet, dangerous conditions were considered acceptable. The smoking ban implemented in 85 should have reduced fire risk, but enforcement was non-existent. Passengers routinely smoked on escalators. The likely ignition source, a lit match or cigarette, should never have been present. London Underground's procedure requiring staff to fight fires themselves before calling the fire brigade was dangerously flawed. Staff lacked training and equipment. Most damning, staff at all levels were utterly unprepared for fire emergencies. No regular training in fire response or evacuation. Communication between staff, transport police and fire brigade was inadequate. Senior management resigned. The investigation produced 157 recommendations. Implementation began immediately. All wooden escalators were replaced with all metal escalators, expensive but necessary. Heat detectors and automatic sprinklers were installed throughout stations. Communication systems were overhauled with direct links to fire brigade dispatch. Staff training was revolutionized with mandatory regular training covering fire behavior, the trench effect, and emergency procedures. These changes worked. Since King's Cross, despite billions of passengers, there has not been another major fire disaster in the London Underground. 6 people received commendations. Station Officer Townsley was posthumously awarded the George Medal for dying while attempting rescue. Sub-Officer Bell received recognition for his firefighting effort. Constable Hanson, who led passengers through the burning ticket hall despite severe injuries, was commended. But the true measure is the lives saved through courage. For survivors and victims' families, King's Cross left trauma that persisted for decades. Nightmares, anxiety attacks, survivors' guilt. Firefighters who responded experienced post-traumatic stress poorly understood in '87. Many who lived through King's Cross carried psychological scars for life. There's a saying in safety: regulations are written in blood. Safety rules only get implemented after disasters prove they're necessary, after people die because protections weren't in place. King's Cross exemplifies this bitter truth. The dangers of wooden escalators, uncontrolled smoking, inadequate equipment and training, delayed emergency response, all were knowable before November 18, '87. Yet it took 31 deaths to force changes that should have been implemented proactively. This lesson extends beyond the underground. Whenever organizations become complacent about known risks because we've always done it this way and nothing bad has happened yet, they create conditions for disaster. The 400 fires before King's Cross without fatalities created false confidence. That confidence shattered in 15 seconds that killed 31 people. The King's Cross fire demonstrated that urban underground spaces create unique hazards requiring specialized understanding. The trench effect discovery showed fire doesn't always behave as expected. The findings about organizational culture and preparedness remain relevant today for any organization managing complex systems where failures kill people. The impact of King's Cross extends far beyond London. Tunnel fire safety regulations worldwide were revised following the disaster. The Channel Tunnel connecting Britain and France, which opened in 1994, incorporated extensive fire safety systems directly informed by King's Cross lessons. Modern metro systems in Asia, Europe, and North America design their underground stations with trench effect mitigation in mind. Fire doors, ventilation systems, emergency lighting, and evacuation routes in underground spaces globally reflect principles learned from 31 deaths in London. The King's Cross investigation also influenced how fire science research is funded and conducted. Before the disaster, fire behavior in complex environments was understudied. After King's Cross demonstrated that unknown fire phenomena could kill dozens of people, governments and institutions worldwide invested significantly more in fire science research. Universities established dedicated fire research laboratories. Computer modeling of fire behavior advanced dramatically. The result has been better understanding of how fires develop in various environments and more effective strategies for prevention and suppression. For firefighters specifically, King's Cross changed tactical thinking about underground fires. The recognition that fires in inclined confined spaces can transition from small and manageable to catastrophic flashover in minutes led to more aggressive initial responses. The modern approach is to assume worst-case scenarios, establish defensive positions early, ensure adequate resources are responding before committing personnel, and prioritize evacuation over fire suppression when conditions suggest rapid fire development is possible. These tactical principles, born from the King's Cross tragedy, have saved firefighter lives in subsequent incidents. The 31 who died deserve to be remembered not just as victims but as the reason the underground became safer, the reason firefighters worldwide understand the trench effect, the reason regulations changed. Their deaths had meaning because lessons learned have saved lives since. That's the only redemption from tragedy, ensuring it drives change, preventing future catastrophes. Safety rules are written in blood. Honor that blood by taking safety seriously before disaster forces change. The King's Cross disaster proved that complacency kills, that ignored warnings eventually manifest as catastrophe, and that organizational cultures prioritizing convenience over safety create the conditions for mass casualties. These lessons transcend time, industry, and geography. They remain as relevant today as they were in 1987. Every organization managing systems where failures can kill people, transportation systems, chemical plants, construction sites, hospitals, nuclear facilities, faces the same fundamental challenge, maintaining vigilance about risks even when nothing bad has happened recently. The human tendency is to become complacent when systems run smoothly for extended periods. "We've always done it this way and it's been fine," becomes justification for not implementing safety improvements that might be expensive or inconvenient. King's Cross demonstrates where that thinking leads. The memorial to the 31 victims at King's Cross Station serves as a permanent reminder. Their names are inscribed for millions of passengers to see. Every person who passes that memorial and reads those names is receiving a message: safety matters, warnings should be heeded, complacency kills. The physical memorial ensures the lessons of November 18, 1987, are not forgotten as years pass and memories fade. If you found this investigation valuable, leave a comment sharing what aspect of this disaster most impacted you. Subscribe to this channel for more detailed examinations of disasters and the lessons they taught. Share this video with others who might benefit from understanding how organizational failures and complacency can lead to tragedy. The goal of studying disasters isn't to sensationalize tragedy, it's to learn from others' mistakes so we don't repeat them. The 31 people who died at King's Cross didn't die in vain if their deaths led to changes that prevented future disasters. That's the responsibility we carry when we study these events, to extract every possible lesson, to share that knowledge widely, and to advocate for implementing protective measures proactively rather than waiting for disaster to force change. Thank you for watching, and remember, the best way to honor those who died in disasters is to ensure their deaths taught us something that prevents future tragedies.